Welcome, everyone. This is Saif Rashidi from the Barakat Trust. We're very happy that you could join us in the third session of our online course about contemporary architecture of the Muslim world, organized by SOAS and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture's educational program. And we're very happy to have two people today who will make for a very interesting discussion and conversation. Anthony Focus, who's a specialist on modern architecture in Africa and wrote a book about the subject. And Shahed Saleem, who is a specialist on Muslim architecture in Britain and has written a book called The British Mosque in Architecture and Social History. And so we're going to look at ideas and notions of identity or identities, given that identity in singular is often a very problematic and complicated term, and perhaps Anthony will reflect on that. But thinking about how do people express themselves as individuals, as groups, as communities, through the buildings that they build and use. And the format of the session is that Anthony is going to talk to us for about 15 minutes about his own experience. We might ask him a question or two, and then we move on to Shahed, who'll talk about his work and his research. And then the last half hour of the session will be devoted to Q&A and a conversation, not just among the three of us, but also among you and anyone who wants to ask anything. So thanks again, and welcome Anthony and welcome Shahed. And Anthony, please, we're delighted to listen to what you have to say and share with us about modern architecture in Africa.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Saif, for introducing this session. I'm going to talk a little bit about what, as you said, my experiences in working on the African continent as a practicing architect in the first place, but gathering a lot of curiosity and questions in my head, which I compounded in some publications and some teaching. Now, the questions that were shot at me are: how have issues of identity changed over time, and how has identity been manifested in architecture from the Muslim world, both focused on the African continent? And I can assure you that gave me a few sleepless nights. It's very difficult to provide short answers to those two questions. And I'll explain in the next 15 minutes why. Now, first of all, in Africa, there is a serious history of architecture, and I'm just showing you a few slides of the most impressive projects that have been constructed over time in Africa, and I'm focusing on two areas: on East Africa and the Swahili culture, which of course is an Islamic culture, which produced a fantastic culture starting in the 8th century and surviving until today, and with a focus here on the Kilwa island, the Kilwa city, which was destroyed in the 15th, 16th century by European colonizers. But also on a smaller scale on the rural area, is East Africa dotted with gems of Islamic architecture that goes back well into the Middle Ages and persisting up to today. And from various origin, Islamic, as you probably know yourself better than I do, is an umbrella expression for many different cultural expressions and also architecture, like the Ibadi architecture, which is a very sober architecture, sometimes compared to the Cistercians in the Middle Ages. On the Western side, I'm just giving you a very few examples very shortly of the pride of Islamic architecture in Africa and culture. Is of course the World Heritage Site of Djenné, the mosque that was built in the 12th century, but which persists up to today and is changed over time. Is an incredibly interesting monument because it almost changes by the year because it's built of mud. But this is not really the identity and the pride that has survived within the continent up to today. And I'll give you some examples of what happened when Africa became part of the modernizing world in the 19th century. This, I think, is a particularly interesting example. It's a palace built by a prince from Cameroon who went schooling in the UK, got a university degree, I think, in accounting, came back and built himself this palace. And a few later, he was hung by the Germans who wanted to appropriate the city and the country. And they also appropriated the palace, and later it became one of the famous buildings, examples of German colonial architecture, whereas it has nothing to do with any German design or German client. Another famous example of this, you could say this frustrating period in the 19th century is the famous House of Wonders in Zanzibar, which was an extremely modern building with electricity and elevator, steel frame, and so on, built in the 1880s by the local sultan, and in an architecture which departed really from the traditional East African architecture, but at the same time is reminiscent and takes on components and includes those Swahili components in a modern form. But the British weren't happy with the independent sultan, and they bombed the city and took possession of Zanzibar, made it into a protectorate. And then also they, like the Germans, they appropriated this magnificent building to make it their colonial administrating office. But first they had to make clear that it was their building, and they erected a tower in front of the building, which is sort of a stacking of all the famous British historical architectural components. It's a beautiful eclecticist tower made of cardboard, but showing the British might over this so-called House of Wonders. And that brings me to this question that Saif already was asking about identity, and in Africa in particular, the identity, the architectural identity, has been either destroyed or appropriated in physical sense, like you saw with the House of Wonders, or in the sense of being part of our own canon of architectural history, like the pyramids in Egypt. And there is a big debate raging as we speak over whether it's African or not African. I don't want to give you any answers to that, but it is definitely a question related to this issue of identity. And this is the identity that was sort of superimposed on the Africans after the great how do you call it, the scramble of Africa in the late 19th century, and the partition of the continent amongst the imperialist powers of the day. And this is the image that was shared with the rest of the world, and that persists up to today, of what is actually African architecture, and that is this archaic huts and small villages, mud and patch, and so on. So the proud buildings that were erected by the local princes in the late 19th century, that image had to be stamped out and was replaced by this one. Now this persists, like I said, up to today, but there were people who were contradicting this at an early moment, like Basil Davidson, who made this beautiful series for the BBC in the 1980s, in which he showed the richness of African cultural history. And there are other famous books on which are about the architecture that sprung from Africa, and that needs to be have a revision and some, I'm just showing some books, but they are rare. They're just a few. Now, this is possibly an important turning moment in that search for identity of African architecture. Is the exhibition in 1993 of two African artists who use maquettes, models, to express themselves to artists, and they are both from French-speaking countries. Abu Draman from, I think, Senegal, and Boris Isaac Kingeles from Congo. And Abu Draman, he interprets the image of the identity of architecture as we all have been knowing for the past century or so, as the typical African dwelling, the mud hut with the thatched roof. But in his maquettes, he says, the last dweller has left the place, and it's time for something else. And this something else is what Kingeles shows. He shows fantastic, literally fantastic buildings and cityscapes, but it's also void of people they yet have to move in. So that marks this moment of where are we now? And this is back in 1993. It's already a while ago, but I think we're still very much in that intermediate phase. Other interesting initiatives, to bring a different perspective on African architecture. I'm showing here, there was a series of conferences organized by NGO Aga Africa in the earlier years of this century, and a Swedish artist who also said, the African continent, if it would have not been colonized in the late 19th century, how would it look like? And this is how he shows it, with all small states that are culturally sort of coherent. You see on the left-hand upper side, you see the purple part is the Swahili world, for instance. And so on. So the more recent authors, they are restitching Africa and at the same time give it a new interpretation of identity. And this goes on for a while. This is rather recent. And last year there was even quite a big conference in Rabat by the African Union of Architects, and I was given the honor also to talk about this. But I must admit that I was very reluctant to talk about this identity thing, as I am reluctant now, and that's why I'm losing this sleep this night, because it's again a European somehow defining the identity of a whole continent. Who am I? So it's a bit of something that sometimes gives me not a very easy feeling. Now, Abu Draman, and I'm going to practice now quickly, inspired at early stage this what they called the style neo-Sudanese. The French were quite very much in love with this type of architecture, and one of their officers from the army, when he came to France from Senegal, he built himself this mosque, which is standing to today, and the same interpretation of this neo-Sudanese style you see in over West Africa, and for instance in this bank from the 1990s. And Kingeles' direction is also being adopted as we speak. His Ville Fantôme, the city of the spirits, is actually being built here and there as we speak. Again, in the 1990s, started with Pierre Goudiaby Atepa, who declared himself, by the way, the greatest architect of Africa. Literally built this kind of hipper, modern, super modern buildings with a clear African identity. And this goes on in recent city plans for each, almost each capital in Africa is now rebuilding itself, building new towns, new business centers, and so on. They are interpreting this hyper modernist architecture, and often banks, by the way. It's probably where the money is, but also where the show-off has to take place, like this one in Mauritius. And I end here with my short expose is that I think another important turn in the coming of a new identity in Africa has been given an enormous boost by the British Prize that was awarded to Francis Quéré last year in his architecture, which is far more modest and grounded, but at the same time really recognizable as African. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting expose. And I wondered, actually, if you could just tell us a tiny bit more about Quéré's work, and to what extent it embodies something that represents Africa or his region of Africa. I mean, it's very different from the other examples that you showed us of banks and huge buildings that are all glass.
Yeah, it starts with the personality of Francis Quéré. He is a man of the people, and he has his brother living still in the village in his ancestral home, and he has his office in Berlin, and they just want to build for the people. And in his architecture, he does use the little means that are at his disposal. He doesn't have the chance and the money to build glass skyscrapers, but he has to build in mud, and well, maybe not thatch anymore, but in the locally available materials, like what you see here, what you saw in the school in Dano is he uses the corrugated iron sheets that are everywhere to be found, and other small and simple materials, but he manages to combine it in a total new repertoire and a new form that makes him unique. But again, it's his modesty and his feet on the ground that make him into such a special person.
Thank you. But I mean, your study of Africa and African architecture is vast. I mean, it covers the entire continent. Do you think that there are? I mean, does every society have a Francis Quéré in terms of what they're trying to do vis-a-vis what's going on in general on the architectural scene? Or do you think it's unusual for someone to be looking more at local material and more at perhaps local tradition than what the average multi-million bank building?
First of all, I have to put something right, Safe. I've only visited something like 15 countries out of 54. So my pretense of talking about the African continent is a bit far-fetched. But from what I know and in my network, what I see popping up, there are places where there are similar initiatives as from Francis Quéré. In the first place in South Africa, but also in Morocco, in Egypt, in Kenya, in Uganda. It's becoming more mainstream now. And I think Quéré's prize will give it an enormous boost, because so far, the architects have not always been taken as a serious profession in many African countries. It's a profession that is quite far down the line. That an engineer and a doctor and a lawyer come first, and then somewhere down the line, the architect follows.
Well, Shahed, do you have any question or comment that you'd like to ask Anthony?
No, I thought it was very interesting. An interesting way in which you sort of describe different types of art practice as well that are looking at exploring the kind of form making in African architecture as well. So I thought that was quite an interesting, quite eye-opening to see artists reinterpreting a sort of traditional formal and urban and architectural language that's going on. Is that happening a lot in art practices of African artists that you've seen?
I think so, yes. Making models is something that is very popular in many countries in Africa. It's like an art expression that is not only used, for the regular souvenirs. You buy a hut from clay or something like that. No, it's also something that is really taken from their own creative mind. And the maquettes, they're not only about buildings, but sometimes they're also about, you know, a gathering of people or a piece of forest or so. They just build a piece of forest, very literally. It's a beautiful way of art expression in my opinion. Mozambique is very strong on that, for instance, but South Africa also.
Thanks. Well, I think maybe let's move on to Shahed, and then we can come back to a conversation once we've also heard Shahed's presentation.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a sort of a more specific region and more specific time frame as well. So I'm talking about Islamic architecture in Britain from the sort of late 19th century up till the present day. But I'm going to just give a very brief overview of the kind of types of building that have been created over that time span, and then talk a little bit about my own, show a couple of my own projects, and then finish with this project, which was a pavilion at the Victoria Albert Museum, which just came down a month ago, and sort of weave a kind of story that goes between the kind of first mosque that was built in Britain to this pavilion that has just recently been built. So the first mosque structure was this pavilion that was built in 1762 in Kew Gardens, and it was built by an architect. It was designed by an architect called William Isaac Chambers, and it was designed as a sort of folly in Kew Gardens, along with a series of other folly type structures, which represented different parts of the kind of non-European world as it was being experienced and encountered by European expansion, colonization, trade, and so on. So there was a Chinese pagoda that was built as well, which is still, that's the only building that is remaining in Kew, and there was also a Japanese temple, and then there was this mosque structure. So it was the first kind of representation of the mosque. So it was encapsulating a particular kind of image of the Muslim world and of Muslim society for a European audience. And then some years later, more than 100 years later, in 1889, the first actual mosque was built, which was functioning mosque, and this was in Woking in just southwest of London, and it was built by a Hungarian Jewish linguist who had spent his working life in India. And when he retired, he came to settle just outside of London, and he was setting up an Oriental Institute where he wanted to teach languages of the Orient, as he called it. So he wanted to build, again, a number of buildings within the grounds, but the only one that he managed to build was the mosque here. And this was, again, very much a sort of quite an exotic representation of the architecture of the Muslim world, but in particular the architecture of kind of Mughal India, which is perhaps where he was, his experience was kind of located. So it was a kind of a distillation of different sort of images of the architecture of India, Muslim architecture of India, and then kind of represented in this quite an exotic and flamboyant and expressive way. So what you see is the first mosque was capturing this idea of this kind of exotic other. Then there was only a handful of mosques between that one and between World War II. And really it's kind of World War II, the emergence of the independent nations emerging from colonization, which led to large migration from the Commonwealth, from former colonized countries. There was migration into Britain. And it's really that process that initiated the kind of emergence of mosques, but also other South Asian religious buildings in Britain for the first time in large numbers. So it's from the kind of 1960s that we really see the kind of history of, the mosque as a building type emerging in any significant numbers. And from that, over the next sort of 40 or 50 years, we have a series of types of mosque architecture that have emerged and evolved. And in my study, I identified three broad categories. There's, for example, the house mosque, which is houses which were adapted and converted into places of worship. And they were kind of the early ways in which the mosque was created. And that's largely because the houses were easy to acquire. And they would be adapted by local communities, local Muslim communities settling in different towns and cities across the country in quite rudimentary ways. So, bedrooms would become the prayer rooms, and then, the front room might become, again, sort of a classroom, and then the bathroom would become ablution facilities, and so on. So the building would be, so the kind of religious use would be kind of grafted onto the existing domestic architecture. And on this top left image here, what you see is this particular house in Bradford. As they extended the building, they added this addition onto the back of it. But you see that they've kind of tried to put in some small minarets and a small dome on top of that. So what we observe is that as soon as is possible, the Muslim communities who have settled in Britain, and they're kind of migrant communities, they try to re-inscribe or identify these buildings with their own visual language, which sort of ascribes an Islamic identity onto them. And that Islamic identity is encapsulated within certain kind of symbols, usually the minaret, the dome, arches, the color of green, and so on. There's the other main type which I identified was the adapted buildings. So all sorts of other buildings which become adapted to create mosques. And on the right hand side, you see a photograph of a warehouse which has become a mosque, and then you see the whole new frontage is put on to that warehouse. So you get this kind of like this kind of hybrid sort of architectural traditional Islamic forms which get rescaled and changed and adapted to make them fit this new kind of landscape. And then on the bottom is the purpose-built building. So after a sort of number of years, 10 or 20 or 30 years, then more purpose-built mosques started emerging. And again, they were built in the early period of purpose-built, meaning from the sort of late 70s through to the 90s. These purpose-built buildings were more kind of hybridized, and then in the later, so from the 2000s onwards, they became more the purpose-built buildings became more kind of like historic references, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But this is an example of an adaptation where an existing church, which was built in the early 20th century, this is in London, is adapted to create a mosque. And you can see that the architecture of the church has these insertions put into it, which quite clearly are kind of referencing a traditional historic architecture of the Islamic world, let's say the kind of Mughal architecture of the Jameel Mosque in Delhi. And you can see the kind of replicas of those domes being applied onto this church, high Gothic, sort of free Gothic church building. So you start to get this new language emerging, which is an amalgamation of the sort of traditional or historic symbols of Islamic architecture, which are brought over by the migrant communities and then applied onto the existing built fabric, and that creates a whole new kind of architectural and visual language, which I find quite fascinating. And that hybridization sort of continued into the early purpose-built buildings, such as this one, where the sort of domestic vernacular architecture of the tiled roof, the brick facade, sort of domestic type windows, for example. You might have these exactly the same kind of things on nearby houses. This one is in a northern city, is combined with, again, Islamic motifs, dome, minaret. And here you see in the gables of the roofs, the arch motif is cut into it. So it's a real kind of like creation of this language onto this vernacular. Now, in my book, I sort of identified that this hybrid ad hoc building changed around the sort of mid-90s with this building, which is which by a designer called Aga Khan Award, who was an Iraqi-born British-based designer. And he designed this mosque in Leeds. And here, I think what you start to see is the emergence of the mosque more as a kind of complete historical replica. So in this one, there is less of the kind of combination of local English vernacular with Islamic form, but it's more a kind of historicized image of the mosque, if you like. And here you can see that mosque that was built, the Bilal Mosque. And it's sort of like there's no, in this one, there's no longer any reference to local architecture or the local vernacular of Northern England, let's say, but it's a completely, almost like one could say, object which all of its references are being pulled from the sort of Muslim world in some form. And here's another example. This one was built later in 2010 in Leicester, which again is, this was partly an existing building and partly a new build. So it was a kind of combination of existing and new, but you see the whole thing has now been recharacterized, in this case as a kind of revival of a Fatimid, Egyptian architecture. So it's very much a sort of historicization of the mosque and of the form and the kind of creation of these kind of replica buildings. So that started happening from the kind of mid-90s through into the 2000s as the kind of revivalist trend. I like to sort of think about it as. So in my own work, I was interested in, I'm an architect and I've designed, I've always worked on a number of mosque buildings, and there's a couple that I've designed which are built. And this one is one in Hackney, on Hackney Road, which is in East London. And I looked at these tile motifs. Well, there's tiles which are actually in the Victoria and Albert Museum, but it's quite a common type of tile from the sort of 13th century and kind of Anatolian region through kind of Central Asian region. And I sort of looked at that as a basis for a design of the building. And I wanted to use that to create the building's facade. So here you see the building on the right-hand side, which is the new build element. And then on the left-hand side is the existing mosque, which was in a house conversion. And then I designed this sort of new addition to that, which then created this kind of pair of buildings. Each of them kind of has a different type of historical reference. So the building on the left is a sort of Georgian building, but the lettering is from its Victorian use as a lock factory. And then on the right, there's references to these Anatolian tiles. But I didn't use the whole tile as a complete thing. I wanted to use the tile only as a fragment. And for me, that's again the question of the way I'm characterizing Muslim migration, or kind of migration of any sort really into Britain or into any European country from the colonies. That in that process of migration, the culture of the migrant community has to be almost like dismantled and then recreated and reconstructed. So in that kind of reconstruction process, my argument is that reconstruction process is always a partial thing. Partly you're recreating and partly you're kind of reinventing. So this facade is a kind of representation of that process by being a fragment of that tile. And then this was another building in Aberdeen in Scotland, where again, it was the new facade, new mosque building. And this was the kind of design studies around a particular facade. So again, tying it back to historic patterns and references and kind of visual language. And that's partly because, that is the kind of heritage of the community that is using the building, but also because it's something that the community recognizes. So it doesn't become too alien for the people who are using it. So my questions are, how do you use that language in a way which can sort of ground it in a presentness as well? So it's not just a kind of historical reference, but it also has a contemporary place. And I worked with an artist called Adam Williamson, and he made these drawings of this sort of pattern work, which was on one hand has its origins in kind of Celtic geometry and also kind of Islamic geometry, and the way in which these two geometries could merge together. So again, a representation by him of the way in which these different cultural histories and trajectories and cultural experiences of the people are merged and are sort of creating new ways of being, actually. And this was the mosque once it was built, and so there was kind of like this part on the facade which is quite a more traditional sort of star pattern, and then that is arranged alongside a more contemporary facade pattern, plus, and all of that sits on top of a granite block facade, because granite is a very common, it's kind of characteristic material in Aberdeen, so that locates the building within its contemporary, within its kind of townscape. And you know, grey is very much a color of grey granite is very much a color of the city, and so it's sort of sitting within the landscape, but also speaking of another cultural history and trajectory and so on. And so that leads me on to the pavilion in the Victoria and Albert Museum. So I designed this pavilion, which was intended to celebrate the month of Ramadan. So it's called the Ramadan Pavilion. It was hosted by the Ramadan Tent Project, or a community organization who host iftars, which is the fast-breaking meal in public places around the country, actually. So they had a series of events. So it was their kind of 10-year anniversary. So it was they hosted their anniversary as this pavilion was part of the celebration of their anniversary. And they hosted a series of events here in the museum, but also in the pavilion throughout the 6 or 7 weeks that it was there. And the pavilion was designed as a space for gathering. So it's a kind of hexagonal space that you can sort of walk into, and it's quite porous. So you can walk into it from any different direction and then walk through it. It was placed within the courtyard of the museum. So it's kind of in you know, many people using it as they enter the museum. And it had each of the key kind of elements, traditional elements of the mosque. So the dome, the minaret, the mihrab, mimbar, these doorways, arched doorways. And it was, each of these elements was referenced from a drawing in the collection of the museum. So the museum is a repository of sort of the European documentation of the Islamic world. So there's many drawings, photographs, paintings of Muslim architecture as it was being experienced and recorded by European travelers and artists. And that in itself constitutes a particular kind of sort of European vision of the kind of non-European Muslim world. And so in referencing each of these, in referencing drawings from that collection, I was kind of almost like reinterpreting the archive, the European archive of the Muslim world, and then recreating it as a contemporary living thing. So it no longer becomes an archival kind of object. And this is the pavilion when it was installed in the museum. So you see the kind of all the key elements are there, but they become this kind of more sort of very, quite expressive. So in a way, not dissimilar to the first pavilion in Kew, and not dissimilar to kind of Woking in terms of it's quite expressive. But this time it becomes a kind of living and real space. So over the period that the pavilion was installed, there were a number of events. This was the opening event, for example, and then it was used as a functional prayer space for specific prayers, not for kind of everyday prayers, but there were kind of specific occasions when people did come for it. But there was one Friday prayer there, for example. There was a prayer on the opening. So there was like specific points at which it was a living mosque, as it were. But then in its daily use, it was a public space. People would just sit there and kind of pass through it and play around it. Children would play there. And it just became part of the courtyard facilities, as it was. So it didn't have its, the kind of normal sort of religious functions were sort of suspended for this period, and it became a space that people could kind of enjoy. And one of the interesting things was observing how people did kind of reuse the elements in ways in which you wouldn't do so in a real mosque, as it were. So the mihrab and the mimbar, for example, are spaces which would not normally be accessed by women, but in this case they could be, and they could be enjoyed by everybody. Children would play on them. People, that men and women could both use them, take photographs with them, and so on. So it became a sort of highly accessible, quite a fluid sort of space. And then this was on one of the Friday prayers when it then again turned into a sort of prayer space. So it kind of oscillated between being a religious space, but also between being a public space where the kind of normal codes of religious use were suspended. And then on the last days of the installation, there was a kind of series of events. One of them was this Somali dance a troupe, which was taking place within the pavilion. So again, the space that is used as a religious space then also becomes a space which is used for leisure, for entertainment, and for cultural activities and performances and so on. So it became this kind of multi-use space. And for me, the thing that's interesting about this is that a lot of my work is about looking at the way in which we can understand or develop a sort of a formal, a formal language which represents the kind of lived experience or reality of Muslims, or Muslim migrants within the UK, for example, in terms of the kind of mosque work that I do, or the historical work that I look at. But this pavilion was as much about its formal representation, it was also about the way in which it is used. It was sort of an experiment in use, because people were able to use it in a number of different ways quite comfortably. And in a way that there's another sort of conversation that takes place then, which is about not so much what does the kind of future of, let's say, Islamic architecture in Britain or in the West look like, but how does it function? What can it be used for, and what are the different ways that it can sort of exist? And I think the different events that happen in the pavilion and the way the pavilion was used is an experimentation and an exploration of that aspect of identity, which is kind of, in what way does use, I suppose in relation to this kind of conversation, the thing that it's significant is in what way, when we explore identity in architecture, in what way do we think about use as much as we think about form and visual culture as well. So yeah, I think I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Shahed. It's an interesting point you make about form and use. But actually, I was wondering, I mean, the thing is, in some ways, what you show us with the Ramadan Pavilion is that a recognizable form that people identify with probably makes it easier for people to feel encouraged to use the space or that form or the space around it for things that represent them. I mean, for example, that courtyard at the V&A, I mean, conceivably anyone could pray on it. I mean, if with permission, you could pray on it on any Friday, but somehow having a physical representation of Muslim identity makes it a perhaps more comfortable place to do that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because I think the kind of symbolic significance of having this, architecture that is recognizable, also that is connected to the historical narratives of Islamic art, architecture, Islamic culture, and that is kind of embedded within also the museum architecture and embedded within the kind of narrative of the museum. All of those things had to be in place first before people could then say, now we're able to kind of use and reuse the space. So the visual symbolism of it was hugely significant. You're right. Yeah, I mean, it's not. We can't discount that in the process for sure.
Basically, I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you, thinking about the mosques that you showed earlier with the green domes and the minarets and green arches, is in your study of mosques in Britain, did you find a difference in the form of mosques with depending on whether the places in which they were built or situated were predominantly Muslim neighborhoods or not? I mean, are these symbols, I mean, who are they expressing identity to?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose most mosques are probably built within areas where there is a significant Muslim population in terms of they're built sort of close to population concentrations, if you like. But when I say significant, they still could be a few percent of the demographic might be Muslim. In some areas, obviously, it's higher. In some of the sort of towns and cities across parts of the UK, there's quite high percentages of Muslim population in the areas where the mosques are being built. And I think I have wondered about that. I think in many ways it's a communication. The mosque is a sort of communication device for the emerging Muslim community and identity, to sort of locate them within a particular historical place. And I think, the mosque is the kind of creation of the mosque is one of the mechanisms by which the community is created. So it's not like the community exists and then the mosque is made. People would be living in a certain place and gradually consolidating, but in the act of making the mosque, like the kind of fundraising and forming the committees, and because it takes years to do, that is a mechanism through which community is a particular kind of community is created. So I think in many ways, in a large part, it's a kind of reflection for oneself. It's a kind of self-reflection and a self and sort of self-creation of a Muslim community that is going on in the making of those buildings.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Anthony, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask Shahed?
Well, yes.
Or comments?
A short one. I was struck by you saying that identity needed to be sort of reconstructed for the diaspora in the UK, the Islamic diaspora. And that's somehow the similar challenge that I think African architecture is facing, more in a broad sense, that you are rethinking your past and refinding your past, and in doing so, I think the tools that you are using, very interestingly, are not reconstruction but deconstruction in a way. You're taking parts or components that are familiar and you remix them, and you go even as far as trying to match them with. And I thought that was particularly beautiful. The one that you are matching the Celtic how do you call it, weave pattern with a Muslim one. I was touched by that, and this approach I think is a beautiful one that could be very inspiring for our colleagues in Africa as well. And I can see it already happening, but it's often done in a very literal sense, which is fine, and like the big bank buildings and so. But it's much more challenging if you can go as far as you did in your pavilion in the Victoria and Albert Museum, that you dare to not only deconstruct it, but also dare to let women and children walk up the minbar. I hope by the way, that your mihrab was faced the right way. Otherwise,
yes, yeah. I hope so as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I'm very inspired by the way you're picking up this glove, this challenge, and I think it's in a way rather similar. The way you're serving the diasporic community in the way that the Africans are in search for identity in their architecture. And I stop here.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good point, because in a way, one could say that I could be talking about this quite a specific process, which was a migration. So there's a particular event which is colonization, there's a particular event which is decolonization, and then there's a particular event which is migration, and that has a kind of geographic reality to it. And so it's quite clearly one can see that if people have moved from one place to another, then it's maybe easy to say that there's a past that they have left, or there's a culture that they have left that they want, that there's an attempt to reconnect with. And I'm thinking that with the African context that you're talking about, where you're in the same country, let's say, but there's still a kind of gap. And I think that gap is maybe it's the kind of process of modernity, the kind of process of going from sort of pre-colonial through modernity to kind of place in which contemporary sort of African cities are in, having to sort of deal with that process of modernization is, the same as dealing with the process of migration in a way. Maybe there's sort of similarities with
I think so. I think that they're both sort of root processes. You're being taken from your roots and you're replanted in a total different context. It's in a way similar that you're living in your own context, but the context is being ignored or destroyed or erased by a superior power or whatever you call it. And they lead to similar processes in refining your identity and recreating also your community. In that, I thought was very, very well said also by you. Is that this process of making those projects to be reminds me a lot of what we did with our friends in Africa in opening up. Opening up perspectives and giving back some pride to a neighborhood, for instance, and then slowly starting, to generate funds and hands to also realize the future. You're really on the job, much more than I've ever been. I remain a foreigner. But I see this process as very, very fruitful also in Africa and similar processes.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, absolutely.
Would you say, Anthony, that in Africa, when mosques have been commissioned, do they also do they try to represent the past?
Now you are opening the box of Pandora. This in Africa, what you see is this different, how do you call it, denominations, or whether it's Shiite or Sunnite or Wahhabite or whatever. It's flocking in, and they are building the mosques. But there is very little, how do you call it, contribution by the local population. It's the Saudis donating a big complex in Zanzibar or in Ouagadougou, and it's a literal transplant of that particular traditional architecture from the region where it's coming from. So I think we're still way off of the situation that Shahed is describing, that there is an honest, equal contribution from the local community in erecting these mosques. Of course, there are also mosques built by the local population, and there is a tradition. But the big landmark mosques that are being built as we speak are often just imported products.
Thanks. Well, actually, there's a question from one of the people participating, which is more about, it's about London and about this idea of representation and identity. And the question is, how do the Regent's Park Mosque and Aga Khan Center, or not the center, the Ismaili Center in London fit into this narrative of representation and identity?
Well, with the Regent's Park Mosque, it was designed by architect Frederick Gibbard, who was a very renowned and well-established architect, English architect through the 20th century, very much grounded in as a modernist. He was kind of one of the early modernist architects of in 1930s, I think his earliest buildings were. And the mosque was one of his last projects, actually. And I think what Gibbard did at that point in time, throughout his life, he'd been a modernist, designing quite contemporary modern buildings in the sort of international style, if you like, of modernism and sort of variations of that. And with the mosque, Regent's Park Mosque, he introduced for the first time in his architecture, I guess, a kind of historic symbols, so the mosque, the minaret and the dome, and the particular kind of arched curtain walling that he designed. And he insisted that this was always a kind of modern building, in that the method of its construction was very kind of contemporary and so on. But he had a lot of criticism from the press at the time, because they considered that it was a sort of pastiche, because it was a period when sort of postmodernism was only just kind of emerging and was not very fashionable. But I think what Gibber did is he really did try to combine languages, and he did that by using a very kind of modernist method of building, materials, and a sort of, you know, architectural syntax, if you like, in terms of space layout, curtain walling, lots of glazing, light coming into the prayer hall from two sides, very kind of light, a very kind of like grand building, but there's a real kind of lightness to it. But he also then incorporated these visual symbols which were going to be recognizable to an emerging sort of migrant Muslim population. So I think he was very much ahead of his time in identifying the need for recognizable mosque architecture, mosque symbols, but then he was really trying to root it in a modernist language. And with the Aga Khan, with the Ismaili Center, that was much more of a sort of modernist project, I think. It was in 1985. The Regent's Park was built in 1977, so Aga Khan came a little bit later. But I think much more kind of explicitly intended as a modern interpretation of Islamic architecture. And I think that probably came from the Aga Khan himself, in terms of like wanting to create architecture and sort of cultures which were much more sort of contemporarily rooted in the kind of Western world. And again, the architects that he used were rooted in a kind of tradition of modernism within Britain. So I think the Regent's Park is much more this kind of coming together of cultures and of architectural, you know, trajectories, whereas the Ismaili Center is much more a sort of overtly kind of modern exploration of what Islamic architecture could be. But they're an interesting pair to look at for sure.
Thanks. Are there other questions from those attending? Please type them in the chat box, and we'll give our comments. We'll be very happy to discuss them and hear them. Well, actually, Shahed, I also wanted to ask you about your own mosque, the one that you showed us with the facade inspired by Kashan tiles. I mean, in some ways, one of the things that made it very striking was how different it was from the green domes and minarets that you showed us on most other buildings. And I wondered, what was the community response to that? I mean, to something that didn't overtly look like what they expect mosques to look like?
Yeah, they were quite. They were sort of fairly. They weren't specific in the beginning about saying that they wanted to have a particular type of architecture, like mosques, like minarets and domes and so on. So they were quite sort of stepped back from that process anyway, because partly it was quite a restricted site, and I think they sort of maybe realized that there was a limited amount that you could actually do on this particular kind of sort of location. And then they were actually quite pleased with the result. They didn't really sort of know what to expect actually, but then they were quite pleased with the outcome. And I think particularly pleased with the way in which the mosque gathered quite a lot of interest in locally. Like a lot of people were quite interested, and a lot of people quite enjoyed it and liked the building. So it didn't just communicate to a Muslim audience, but also the kind of wider public as well were quite sort of became, I think, quite sort of, you know, fond of it and sort of celebrated it to a certain degree. So I think they liked it. It gave them a certain kind of presence, I think, in the local area, a certain kind of place in a way. So overall, they were quite pleased with the outcome, but they weren't necessarily they didn't know what to expect, actually. So,
okay. And you find, Anthony, for example, in your study of modern architecture in Africa, do you find that kind of as you go, do you think that more recent projects have more of an attempt to express a local identity, or is there no correlation between the period of time and what people are trying to capture in big? I mean, you showed us many big, the thing with big buildings like the ones you showed is that obviously they have big budgets, and therefore there's the ability to think, well, this is what we want to demonstrate, or this is what we want to do. It isn't just kind of barely making ends meet. And I wondered what sorts of trends you've seen in the more recent buildings that you studied.
Yeah, I think history does play a role in cultural places. Like I think I limit myself to Zanzibar here, which was by far the most important city in East Africa up to the early years of last century. And the city of Zanzibar was a big city, even to Western conditions, and the architecture was very mature. But the city is rebuilding itself, and that most of it is done by local technicians or even the people themselves building. But what you see, for instance, is that they are rebuilding their mud house with a tin roof, and they are putting up an apartment block. But they take out the old front door, which in Zanzibar is very famous, the carved door, and they put it back in the new building. And then on top of the building, they put also clear markers of their own identity. Sometimes some Merlins or some dados. I don't know how you call that in the facade, but things that are clearly reminiscent of their own architecture in a very cool collage way, of which is sometimes very very successful, architecturally speaking, I must say. And amongst my colleagues, I see a similar interest, even though it's more into the tourist oriented work. I think the tourist market is an important client for the architects in East Africa. Again, I'm only talking about East Africa, Zanzibar now, in which the tourists expect to be lodged in a place that does look Zanzibari. So the architects are playing there the role of making sure it gets the right Swahili sense. In how far that is also truly within their own spirit, I am not so sure. I think architects and local clients alike are, as I said before, are still very much searching for a new way of expressing their own identity. But it's definitely taking place. There is you see how do you call it, citations everywhere in almost all buildings that are erected in Zanzibar. And I was just saying, about these mosques, the landmarks mosques. Yes, they are being imported and they are being imposed, but the local mosques are often very cleverly designed and combine often also more functions. That is something that amazes me. I don't know if that's as a typology is also existing elsewhere in the Islamic world, but it's not uncommon to have a small shopping center with mosque on top of it in the dense fabric of Zanzibar, and that gives very interesting typologies. So things are happening, and I could if I had known you were interested in this kind, I would have focused a bit more on that. But I'm more as an observer there, and then I have done really research on that subject. But it's interesting to see the survival of and the persistence of cultural citations, but not only formal citations, but also functional citations of functions that are famous to Zanzibar, like the Baraza place, which is like a threshold place in between the public and the private, that's been retained and been reinterpreted in modern architecture. But then you have to give me another lecture, and then I will tell you more about that.
Okay. No, but I think it's interesting how actually spatial relationships and how people use space are often valued, and they do persist despite changes of material and form and style and time. And even, I mean, it was interesting what you said, Anthony, about the fact that people retain the old carved doors and reuse them in their new building, because it shows a sense of pride and a sense of valuing something that belongs to them. And I think these are, when we talk about identity and what people feel represents them, these are sometimes they're very small details, but they're telling ones.
Well, we actually did research with our small NGO in the around 2016 to 2019, and produced an atlas of the other side of Zanzibar. Now I'm making a little bit of advertisement. Everybody knows Stone Town in Zanzibar is World Heritage Site, but there is another side of Zanzibar which has always been ignored from colonial times onwards, but is as old and historically important as Stone Town itself. And we did make an atlas and an inventory of all the 4,000 odd buildings there. And we took even the step to classify them in some sort of, denomination. And we came to a denomination which not everybody was happy with, but I thought it was sort of provoking discussion. And then we call it Swahili 2020. This is exactly what you're asking, and how do you define this Swahili 2020? Well, it's a multi-story building that's replacing the old Swahili house, but it does retain and does reinterpret both formal and how do you call it, intangible components from the traditional architecture, but in a very creative and modern way. So this atlas is actually available online. It's open source research.
Okay, wonderful. I'll share it so that if anyone wants to access it, because I think access to materials that tell us about what's happening are so important. Actually, there's a question for Shahed, which is someone's asking about the intersection between architecture, diaspora, displacement, and collective memory. And I mean, last week we discussed tensions between architects to the vision of the client and the natural environment. But this question is, in a cosmopolitan environment, how can we balance between serving local communities and appeasing the new society that then becomes home?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of interesting points in the question. I think displaying collective memory. I mean, I think that for me, it's about. I mean, I think the architecture of the let's say the mosques that we're talking about mosques now, but the architecture of the mosques that are built here in Britain or in the UK are sort of by de facto largely built by migrant communities. I mean, not always the case, but 99% are migrant communities building these mosques, and they are kind of just by virtue of them being built by such communities are already talking about sort of displacement and diaspora and the memories and some collective memories of those communities that they are serving. I think in terms of how they kind of situated within the existing context, existing culture, I don't know whether it's necessary to sort of appease in the sense, but maybe it's more about them being able to be read by a sort of a number of different communities, including like the kind of host community, as it were. So for me, it's about creating buildings or architecture which speaks a number of different voices, speaks a number of different languages, if you like, and has a number of different voices, and it can be interpreted in different ways. So that although its kind of main interpretation may be rooted within a kind of Islamic or Muslim kind of heritage or narrative of some sort, it also has a meaning at some level for multicultural communities, so people from different sort of backgrounds. So I think that's the kind of balance that I'm trying to find, I suppose, in my work, which is how do these spaces become kind of multivocal and kind of multi-layered, to be able to, so people to be able to relate to them in a number of different ways.
For example, the Islamic Center in Edinburgh,
yeah,
which has this restaurant and I mean, it's interesting in that it also serves a broader community, or the broader community that of everyone that happens to be in the vicinity wanting a good, nice, warm meal. And so sometimes, I think that's an example of how you can be both serving a local or distinct community, but also everyone else, that you don't have to either be one or the other.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's kind of like, in its functionally, that's how it kind of like quite literally serves a number of different communities. And I think that's one of the things maybe to explore further as time goes on, which is the kind of uses that these buildings have. Like, do they have more kind of like multifunctional uses? It's a kind of ongoing question. In some cases it's appropriate, maybe in some cases it isn't. But kind of visually and architecturally as well, I think is the
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think of how spaces like mosque courtyards, for example, play this role sometimes of being a gray zone or a kind of transitional zone between a prayer space and the rest of what's going on outside. And often you do find that those spaces, and you find them in Christian religious buildings as well, the cloisters, and I mean the areas that are more publicly accessible in a way that people use them to sit and relax and read, and so they do have a function that's meditative, without necessarily being religious.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I see there's the follow-up comment I see.
Yeah. And also, I suppose the planning process and the process of consultation and approvals in any building project does mean, presumably, that there is some sort of debate or some kind of discussion or consideration of different points of view, even if one is stronger than the others or some are stronger than others. I'm sure that also applies to the African context, Anthony, that if someone was funding a mosque or funding a religious building that was totally, government authorities felt was totally inappropriate or different or alien, they might say, well, actually, we like some aspects of what you're proposing, but we also want this, or we'd like it to look in this way or use these materials.
Well, I'm reducing again my answer to Zanzibar, but in Zanzibar there is a strong parallel power within the Waqf community, and they are sort of, due to colonial administrative legislation, they are sort of mixed into the government administration, but they at the same time they're quite independent, and I do not think that there is any restriction or any influence from government side or elsewhere on what the Waqf community builds and erects. It's very strong, and they are still even the administrative subdivision, the how do you call it, the wards are often related to former mosque communities, in which the mosque is the center of the area, and if a new mosque is to be constructed, is often because they're adding another, what they call shahia, to the city. I don't know if that really answers your question.
No, but it's an interesting point, because I would say, from my experience of talking to Shahed over the years, I imagine that in your case, Shahed, the kind of projects that you work on, there's a lot less autonomy in terms of what you can build, and you do have to fit in within guidelines and rules and opinions and what do the neighbors think.
To a certain extent, but also, in a lot of cases, maybe more recently being even the last sort of 20 years, kind of often local authorities have wanted to see buildings which are more culturally expressive, actually, and which do sort of like demonstrate a kind of diversity of cultures and communities. So it can vary. Like in some cases, I think that kind of a sort of blanket it needs to fit in idea is more or less been replaced now with a more varied approach, I think, in terms of the way that local authorities would look at these buildings.
But perhaps do you think that's related to a greater sense of the importance of celebrating diversity?
I think so, yeah, and a greater sort of desire to demonstrate a kind of multiculturalism of some form, yeah, for sure.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see how things pan out in the future and how, for example, I mean, both in Britain, but also in the context of East Africa, whether you might find that in the future, local authorities might say, yeah, well, we've decided that we want a more local identity in our religious architecture and we want it to represent us. And I mean, that could be possible, but it might not always be this, here's our architect and here's our design.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. There may be these sort of the sort of direction that things go in. Yeah, to see how things go.
Well, thank you very much to the two of you. It was a really fascinating contrast between the two examples and thinking about which ways are they similar, which ways are they different. I mean, which elements people retain or celebrate as part of an identity that represents them. And thank you also, Anthony, for mentioning your the online resource that we can use. I'll make sure that it's shared. And thank you again. I mean, next week, we're going to look at examples of projects in the Muslim world that have dealt with an urban context and the challenges of urbanization. But I'm glad that we were able to include in this session two places which people don't often associate with the Muslim world. I mean, in general, Europe is not, I mean, even though there are many Muslims in Europe and many Muslim communities, it's somewhat overlooked, or it's not seen as the first place that people think about. And I would say the same for East Africa, that sometimes, too often, I would say there's a focus on the Middle East as being the Muslim world, and actually, of course, it's only one part of it. So thank you very much for your really valuable contributions.
Yeah, thank you, Saif, and for attendees and for all the organization. Much appreciated.
Yeah, me too. And many thanks. Just a word about SOAS. There are some guys around there who have strong roots in East Africa. I don't know if they're still around, but the Swahili culture is something not to be overlooked, and it's a Muslim culture, but it's growing by the day in its importance. So you will hear more from that. I'm pretty sure.
Okay, well, Anthony, it's just one last question for you, which I hadn't noticed. What would you say are the most important lessons learned that you'd like to leave us with? And the person who's asking says, if she found herself touring Zanzibar or Burkina Faso or Mali, what should she be mindful of when taking in the architectural scale?
Can you repeat the question? Because
okay, I'll repeat the second part, which is in touring Zanzibar or Burkina Faso or Mali, what should someone be mindful of in trying to take in the architecture?
Sure. Boy,
it's not.
It's not in. There's not very much in the tourist guides about architecture, and it's often not what you see is what there is. I think the best answer is give it time and speak to the people, and then they will show you very unexpected places, which are often indoors. The architecture in Africa is not monumentally oriented, traditionally speaking. In most African culture, there is no reason to erect monuments to remind the past, because the past is is given forward in an oral culture and not marked by obelisks and temples and memorials as we are used to in Europe. So the architecture is playing a much more different role and is ingrained within the community rather than a sort of markers that are put there to remind you of the fantastic history. So it's more of a labyrinthic exercise, but go off the trodden path and listen to the people and take time. It's maybe a bit of a silly advice, but that is what a real amateur of architecture in Africa should do.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way to close our session and to encourage people to explore and to take the time and actually to find what might not immediately be obvious.
Exactly. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.